On July 16, 2024, the bodies of two people with gunshot wounds were found in a house on Peachtree Street in a suburb of Atlanta. The events leading up to the tragedy began the day before. George Baxter had been working as a delivery driver for UPS for 7 years. He was 34 years old, and his life had become a monotonous cycle of routes, packages, customer complaints, and constant stress at work. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of Atlanta with his wife Lisa, who was 31. They had married 4 years earlier, when Lisa was working as a simple receptionist at a dental clinic, and George had just received a promotion and a stable route. At the time, it seemed to them that they were building something solid. But over the past 4 years, something had changed. Lisa had become an administrator at the same clinic, started earning more money, and began talking more often about how their house was too small, how their neighbors lived better, how other people had opportunities that they didn't have. George didn't understand when exactly his wife had started looking at him with disappointment, but for the past few months, that feeling had not left him. He noticed how Lisa stayed late at work, how she avoided conversations in the evenings, how she smiled at her phone more often. On July 15th at noon, George met his best friend Lucas Cruz at a bar on the outskirts of town. They had been friends since adolescence, had attended the same school, and had looked for their first jobs together. Lucas was a mechanic at a car repair shop, 35 years old, unmarried, and living a measured bachelor's life. George had always considered him a reliable person, someone he could trust. The bar was half empty. The bartender was bored behind the counter, and 2 men were playing pool in the corner. George and Lucas sat at a table by the window with bottles of beer in front of them. George looked exhausted. His UPS uniform shirt was wrinkled, and he had dark circles under his eyes. "I don't know how to explain it," George began, squeezing the bottle. "But something's wrong. Lisa's acting strange. She's pulling away from me. I feel it every day." Lucas listened attentively, nodding occasionally. He knew George well enough to understand that his friend was not prone to dramatizing without reason. "Maybe she's stressed at work?" Lucas suggested. "You know how it is. People withdraw when they're tired." "No, it's not stress." George shook his head. "She's become too concerned with her appearance. She's buying new clothes, even though she used to say we couldn't afford them. She's constantly on her phone. When I ask her who she's texting, she says it's her friends. But I don't believe her. What do you think?" George fell silent, staring out the window. Cars slowly passed by outside, the city going about its usual business. He took a sip of beer and said what had been bothering him for a long time. "I think she's cheating on me. With our neighbor, Carlito Espinosa." Lucas frowned. He had seen Espinosa several times, a tall man with a confident gait, the owner of a chain of grocery stores. Carlito lived in the house next door to the Buxers, and his life was clearly more successful. "Why do you think that?" Lucas asked cautiously. "Because I see her talking to him," George replied, anger creeping into his voice. "When he comes out into the yard, she always finds a reason to come out too. They stand by the fence, laughing. She never laughs like that with me. And he looks at her like she belongs to him. I know that look." "George, listen." Lucas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You can't jump to conclusions just because they talk. People talk to their neighbors, it's normal. Maybe you're just overthinking it and now you're seeing things that aren't there." "I'm not an idiot," George replied sharply. "I feel like she's hiding something from me. And this Espinosa, he has everything I don't have. Money, a big house, an expensive car. He's divorced, lives alone. Lisa constantly compares me to others. She says we could have a better life." Lucas sighed. He understood that George was in a state where logic was giving way to emotion, but he still tried to bring his friend back to his senses. "Okay, let's say you're right and something is going on, but you can't just jump on Espinosa with accusations. You need proof. Watch her a little longer. See how she behaves. Maybe you should talk to her directly, calmly." "I already tried talking to her," George said with a bitter smile. "She denies everything. She says I'm paranoid, but I can see her eyes when she lies." They fell silent. Lucas didn't know what else to say. He wanted to help his friend, but he felt that the situation was getting out of control. "Don't do anything rash," he said finally. "Just watch. If something is really wrong, you'll find out. But don't ruin everything with your own hands before it's time." George nodded, though his eyes still burned with anxiety. They finished their beers and went their separate ways. Lunch break was over. After lunch, George returned to the UPS base, where his supervisor, Camila Ramos, was already waiting for him. She was 42 years old, had been with the company for 15 years, and had earned a reputation as a tough, demanding manager. Camila made no secret of her dissatisfaction with George. He often broke the rules, was rude to customers, and was late. She considered him an irresponsible and unprofessional employee. "Baxter," she called out as soon as he entered the building. Her voice was cold and sharp. "Come into my office immediately." George clenched his jaw but followed her. In the office, Camilla sat down at her desk and took out a folder with documents. "This morning we received a complaint from a client on Oak Avenue," she began, without looking at him. "You left the package at the door, didn't ring the bell, didn't wait for confirmation. The client didn't find the package until 2 hours later, and it could have been stolen." "I rang the doorbell 3 times, George replied. "No one answered. I left a note." "The customer says otherwise." Camilla looked up. "And I'm inclined to believe the customer, not you. This is the 3rd complaint this month, Baxter. Do you realize your job is on the line?" "I'm doing my job." George felt irritation rising inside him. "If the customer doesn't open the door, I can't stand there all day." "Your job is to ensure delivery," Camilla snapped. "Not to make excuses. One more complaint and we'll review your contract. You can go." George left the office, barely containing his anger. He knew Camilla hated him, and the feeling was mutual. He loaded the van and set off on his route, but his mind was far away. Camilla's words, his suspicions about his wife, Espinosa's face, it all swirled around in his head, preventing him from concentrating. In the evening, when George was returning home, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. He turned onto his street and immediately noticed Lisa. She was standing at the edge of their property, near the low fence that separated their yard from Carlito Espinosa's. Standing next to her was Espinosa himself, a tall, fit man in a light-colored shirt. They were talking, and Lisa was laughing. Her laughter was light, sincere, the kind George hadn't heard in a long time. Something inside him snapped. He slammed on the brakes, turned off the engine, and got out of the van. Lisa turned around, saw her husband, and the smile faded from her face. Espinosa stood calmly, squinting slightly. "What's going on here?" George approached quickly, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "George, we were just talking," Lisa began, but he interrupted her, addressing Espinosa. "Have you completely lost your mind? Do you think I don't see what you're doing? You're hanging around my wife as if I don't exist." Espinosa raised an eyebrow, his face remaining impassive. "I don't know what you're talking about, Baxter. We were just discussing water supply issues in the neighborhood. Maybe you should calm down." "Don't you dare tell me what to do." George took a step closer, his fists clenched. "I know there's something going on between you two. I can see the way you look at her." "George, stop it." Lisa tried to stand between them, but George pushed her away. Espinosa smirked, and there was contempt in that smirk. "If you're a nobody who can't keep his wife, don't blame others for it," he said calmly, but every word was a blow. George didn't remember swinging his arm. His fist slammed into Espinosa's face, and he staggered backward. Lisa screamed, but George couldn't hear her anymore. He landed a few more blows, and Espinosa tried to defend himself, but he wasn't expecting such fury. They fell to the ground, and George continued to hit him until he felt someone's hands grab his shoulders. "George, stop!" Lisa pulled him back with all her strength. "You're going to kill him! Stop it!" George let go of Espinosa, breathing heavily. His neighbor lay on the grass, blood flowing from his nose, bruises already forming on his face. Lisa struggled to lift her husband and dragged him toward the house. "You're crazy," she whispered, pushing him toward the door. "Completely crazy." Inside the house, George turned sharply toward her, all his suspicions bursting out. "You're sleeping with him. You're cheating on me with that Espinosa. Admit it." Lisa looked at him with wide eyes, filled with fear and shock. "No, I'm not sleeping with him. George, I swear to you, I've never been with Carlito. You made this all up." "Don't lie to me," he shouted. "I see how you talk to him. You've never been like that with me." "That's because you're paranoid," she replied, her voice breaking with tears. "You follow my every move. You suspect me of everything. I'm tired of it, George. I was just talking to my neighbor and you almost killed him." "Swear," George demanded, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Swear that there's nothing between you." "I swear," Lisa looked him in the eyes, "I'm not cheating on you with Carlito. It's all in your head." George let her go and stepped back. They stood facing each other in silence. The tension between them was so thick that it seemed to thicken the air. Lisa wiped her tears and turned away, going into the bedroom. The door closed behind her. George was left alone in the living room, his hands shaking, and one thought racing through his head. She's lying. He was sure she was lying. The morning of July 16th began with a heavy silence. George woke up early. Lisa was sleeping with her back to the wall. They hadn't spoken since the evening. He got dressed in his uniform, left the house without breakfast, and drove to the UPS base. In the rearview mirror, he could see his face, haggard, with red eyes. He had hardly slept. All night long, he had replayed yesterday's scene in his head, Espinosa's words, Lisa's vows. He didn't believe her. He couldn't believe her. At the depot, he was greeted by the usual hustle and bustle. Drivers loading vans, sorters carrying boxes, someone arguing loudly on the phone. George walked to his van, hoping to get to work without any unnecessary conversation. But before he could open the back door, he heard a familiar voice. "Baxter, come to my office, now." Camila Ramos stood at the entrance to the administration building with her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was impenetrable, but George knew that look. Another dressing down. He slowly followed her, feeling irritation boiling up inside him. In the office, Camilla didn't even offer him a seat. She remained standing behind her desk, while George froze at the door. "Yesterday, after your lunch break, you returned to base 23 minutes late," she began, looking at the printout. "This is a violation of work discipline. You didn't even bother to notify the dispatcher of the delay." "I met a friend," George replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The conversation went on longer than expected. It didn't prevent me from completing my route." "No one asked you if it interfered or not," Camilla said coldly. "The rules apply to everyone. You broke them. And this isn't the first time. Yesterday I warned you that one more complaint and we would review your contract. Now, in addition to the complaint, there is a systematic violation of the schedule. You're just looking for a reason to fire me." George felt the words spill out. "You don't care how I work. You hate me, and everyone knows it." Camilla straightened up, her eyes narrowing. "I hate irresponsible employees who think the rules don't apply to them," she said slowly. "If you think you can talk to me like that, you're wrong, Baxter. You're hanging by a thread. And if you don't get your act together, I'll personally make sure you're looking for a new job." "Go ahead," George said. "I had 7 years of perfect service until you started picking on me for no reason." "Get out of my office." Camilla's voice turned icy. "Right now, and don't you ever dare talk to me like that again." George turned and left, slamming the door behind him. His hands were shaking with anger. He knew he had just made the situation worse, but he couldn't help himself. All the tension that had built up over the last few days was looking for an outlet, and Camilla happened to be at hand. He loaded the van, checked the list of addresses, and set off on his route. The first few hours of work passed mechanically. George stopped at houses, delivered packages, got signatures, and returned to the van. His thoughts were far away. He thought about Lisa, about what she had said yesterday. She swore she wasn't cheating on him with Espinoza. But if not with him, then with whom? Or was he really going crazy, and there was no cheating? George didn't know what to believe. The only thing he was sure of was that something between them had broken, and he didn't know if it could be fixed. Around noon, while looking through the next block of addresses, George noticed a familiar street. Oak Hill Drive. Number 127. It was Lucas Cruz's address. George felt his mood lift a little. He was glad to have the opportunity to see his friend. After yesterday's conversation at the bar, Lucas seemed to be the only person who understood him. Maybe he should talk to him again, tell him what happened with Espinoza last night. Lucas always gave good advice. George turned onto Oak Hill Drive and drove slowly down the street, looking for the right house. Lucas lived in a small one-story building with a neat lawn and a garage on the side. George drove closer and suddenly saw a car parked at the curb, a blue sedan. He recognized it instantly. It was Lisa's car. George stopped before reaching the house. His heart began to beat faster. What was Lisa doing here? At Lucas's house? He looked at his watch. It was around 12:30. Lisa should be at work. The clinic was open until 6 p.m. and she never left early. Why was her car here? At first, George tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe she had stopped by for some reason. Maybe Lucas had repaired something for her. They knew each other, after all, and Lucas often visited their house. But the longer George looked at the car, the stronger his suspicion grew, cold and heavy as a stone. He got out of the van, taking the package for Lucas with him. His feet carried him to the house automatically. George climbed the porch and stopped in front of the door. It was quiet inside. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Lucas often didn't lock the door during the day when he was home. George pushed the door open and went inside. There was no one in the living room. The dishes were on the kitchen table, the TV was off, everything looked normal. George listened. Silence. But then he heard something, a quiet sound coming from deep inside the house. Voices, laughter, a woman's laughter. George walked down the hall to the bedroom. The door was ajar. He pushed it open wider and froze in the doorway. Lisa and Lucas were lying on the bed, half naked. They didn't notice him right away. They were too absorbed in each other. Lisa was lying on her side, her hand resting on Lucas's chest, and they were talking quietly about something, smiling. Then Lucas turned his head and saw George. He froze, his face turning pale. Lisa sensed the change and turned around too. Her eyes widened, and her smile vanished instantly. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent, broken only by George's heavy breathing. "George," Lucas began, sitting up on the bed and pulling the blanket over himself. "Shut up!" George's voice was quiet, but there was such fury in it that Lucas fell silent. Lisa tried to get up, threw on a shirt, her hands shaking. She opened her mouth to say something, but George stopped her with a glance. "You swore," he said slowly, looking at his wife. "Yesterday you swore to me that you weren't cheating on me. You looked me in the eyes and swore." "George, it's not what you think." Lisa took a step toward him, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Don't you dare," his voice trembled. "Don't you dare tell me it's not what I think. I see it with my own eyes. You're in bed with my best friend, with the man I trusted, the man I told about my suspicions yesterday." Lucas finally got out of bed and pulled on his jeans. His face was gray, his eyes filled with shame and fear. "George, listen to me," he began. "It wasn't on purpose. We didn't plan it." "Not on purpose?" George took a step closer, and Lucas instinctively backed away. "You're sleeping with my wife, and it wasn't on purpose? How long has this been going on?" Lisa and Lucas exchanged glances. The silence lasted too long, and that silence told George more than any words could. 3 months, Lisa said quietly. "It started 3 months ago." George felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. 3 months. All this time she had been lying to him. All this time Lucas, his best friend since adolescence, had been betraying him. Yesterday at the bar, Lucas had looked him in the eye and advised him not to jump to conclusions, reassuring him, and all the while, he had been sleeping with his wife. "Why?" George asked, looking at Lisa. "Why did you do it?" Lisa raised her head, and there was no remorse in her eyes. There was something else: fatigue, disappointment, even relief that everything had finally come out. "Because it wasn't enough for me," she said. "What you could give me wasn't enough, George. I wanted more, not just money or a bigger house. I wanted to feel alive, I wanted excitement, passion. With you, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. Every day was the same. Your paranoia, your suspicions, your inability to give me what I needed." "And you found that with him?" George nodded at Lucas. "With my friend?" "I wasn't looking for it," Lisa replied. "It just happened. Lucas understood me. He listened to me. He gave me what you couldn't." "George, I know this is awful," Lucas interjected, stepping forward. "I know we both betrayed you, but it wasn't planned. We fell in love with each other." "Fell in love." George repeated the words, as if tasting them. "You fell in love with my wife. You sat with me at the bar yesterday, listened to me talk about my suspicions, calmed me down, told me not to jump to conclusions, and all the while, you were sleeping with her." "I was ashamed." Lucas lowered his gaze. "I didn't want to hurt you. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop seeing her." "You didn't want to hurt me." George smirked, and there was nothing human about that smile. "But you fucked my wife for 3 months straight. You came to my house, sat at my table, drank my beer, called me your friend. And all this time, you were betraying me." Lisa took another step toward him, her voice now harsher, without apology. "I won't apologize," she said. "I made my choice. Yes, I cheated on you. Yes, I lied. But I don't regret it. Because with Lucas, I feel something I haven't felt with you in a very long time. And if you were honest with yourself, you would admit that it's been over between us for a long time." "Over?" George looked at her, not recognizing her. This wasn't the woman he married, or maybe it was the same woman, but he had never seen her true self. "You destroyed our family. You betrayed me with my best friend, and you're telling me you don't regret it?" "No," Lisa met his gaze. "I don't regret it." George stood motionless, looking at them both. At Lisa, who was no longer his wife. At Lucas, who was no longer his friend. The two people he trusted most in the world had destroyed his world. And they stood before him, feeling no remorse. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, George reached down to his waist. There, in the holster he wore every day at work, was a gun. A company-issued weapon that drivers were allowed to carry for protection. He had carried it for 7 years and never used it. George pulled out the gun and raised it. "George, no!" Lucas raised his hands, backing away. "Don't do it, please! George, put the gun down!" Lisa's voice faltered for the first time. "You don't want to do this." George looked at them. There were no thoughts in his head, only emptiness and pain so sharp that it seemed to tear him apart from the inside. He saw fear in their eyes. Finally, they were afraid. Finally, they understood what they had done. "You're right," he said quietly, looking at Lisa. "I don't want to, but I have to." The first shot rang out deafeningly in the silence of the bedroom. Lucas fell, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to say something, but only a wheeze escaped his throat. He slumped to the floor, leaning his back against the wall. Lisa screamed and tried to run, but George turned toward her. Their eyes met for a second, hers filled with horror, his with nothing. A second shot cut off her scream. Lisa fell onto the bed, her hand slipping helplessly downward. Blood quickly spread across the white bedding. George stood in the middle of the room, holding the gun. The ringing in his ears slowly subsided. He looked at the bodies, at Lucas, who was no longer breathing, leaning against the wall, and at Lisa, lying motionless on the bed where she had been with another man just a few minutes ago. He lowered the gun. His hands weren't shaking. Inside, there was a strange emptiness, as if something important inside him had died with them. George turned and left the bedroom. He walked down the hall, through the living room and out onto the porch. The sun was shining brightly, birds were singing outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened. George sat down on the porch steps and put the gun next to him. He took out his phone and looked at the screen. He should have called. He should have called at 911 and reported what he had done. But he just sat there, looking at the empty street, and waited. Sooner or later, someone would hear. Someone would come. For now, he just sat there in the silence that seemed endless.